Hello, students! First off, I want to say congrats on making it through this first reading. It's not an easy one, primarily because you are not the target audience for this article. And so, before I get into a discussion of the questions you all answered, I want to give you a bit more background on the author and the context for this article. A Humanistic Rationale for Technical Writing was written in 1979 by Carolyn Miller when she was a doctoral candidate in Communication and Rhetoric at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Rochester, New York. At the same time, she was also teaching writing at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. How could she accomplish this feat of geography in 1979 when Skype was basically a technology only seen in sci-fi? Well, she was probably at the stage where she was mostly writing her dissertation, so most likely she lived in Raleigh and planned to fly back to Rochester to defend her dissertation once she finished it. So that's who wrote the piece. Now for some context. Carolyn Miller was, and probably had been for a while, teaching writing classes to support herself while she got her PhD. This is pretty typical of graduate students in rhetoric, writing, and literature fields. She was teaching in a department of English, which meant that though her specific area of expertise was rhetoric, some of her colleagues were likely experts in literature or creative writing and may have known very little about the study of rhetoric. English departments can be kind of weird like that sometimes. English departments were, at that time, and still often are, one of the places that students of all majors go to get their humanities requirements. And in 1979, the humanities requirement would likely have been a writing class in which students read and wrote about literature. Composition courses that today focus more on the writing itself and sometimes not on literature at all wouldn't really become what they are today for another couple of years, maybe even a decade. And technical writing classes would have just been a class that might have been required by technical and scientific majors. It would not have been considered a humanities requirement, and frankly, Carolyn Miller's colleagues in literature and creative writing might not have wanted it to become one, because they may have wanted their classes to be the humanities requirement. Okay, so the stage is set. Now, let's talk about the questions. I'm not actually going to start with question 1. I'm going to start with question 2, go to 3, go to 1, and then come back to question 4. First, what is the windowpane theory of language? The windowpane theory of language is a metaphor for a particular idea about how language works. In this theory, communicating is akin to seeing another person's thoughts and ideas. Language is the window, the glass through which people see those thoughts and ideas. The thoughts and ideas are on the other side of the glass, and people use language to see through it. In this theory, if language is muddled or unclear, then the readers can't see the author's thoughts and ideas on the other side of the language glass. In the windowpane theory of language, the meaning of those thoughts and ideas on the other side of the glass is fixed and unchangeable, and if we just choose the right words, the clearest words, then readers will have no problem seeing what we mean. And the language we use to talk about writing and meaning are deeply embedded in this theory. When we say, "I see what you mean," or "your meaning isn't clear here," or "I don't see what you're saying," we are relying on this commonly held theory of language. Okay, question 3. What does Miller think of the windowpane theory of language? Miller is not a fan of the windowpane theory of language. She thinks that the windowpane theory of language reflects what she calls a positivist view of science, and well, other people call it that too. Positivism is the idea that there is some kind of objective reality out there in the world apart from the people who perceive it, and that it is science's job to uncover that reality, to discover hard facts and truths about the world that exist outside of human perception. Miller says that if this is true about science, and if the windowpane theory of language is also true, the theory of language which would supposedly allow readers to see the objective truth about science clearly through language, if both of these things are true, then technical writing, most writing really, becomes a set of maneuvers for staying out of the way. In this view, writing is just a skill, and skilled writing is clear writing that allows readers to simply see the truth. However, again, Miller is not a fan of either of these theories, and that's for 2 separate reasons. 1, she understands the work of science, and 2, she understands the work of rhetoric. Let's start with science. A lot of people think of science as a collection of facts about the world, but as several historians and philosophers of science like Bruno Latour and Thomas Kuhn have said, science is actually a profession. It's an action. It's a thing that people do. And importantly, it's a thing that people do. Science is made up of the work of scientific communities, and within scientific communities there is consensus about many things, but there's also debate and uncertainty about even more things. There are people, for example, who think that one method for studying a problem is great, but other people who say, no, this other method is better. That's partly because even if there is an objective reality out there in the world, no matter what we do, human beings will always only be able to access the reality through human perception. There is no direct data dump into our brains from the world outside. We perceive the world through our human bodies and through the instruments of science, which were made by people. There's always a layer between us and the outside reality. This means that all scientists must perform acts of interpretation in their data collection and analysis, and there's always debate and uncertainty about that because we each perceive and interpret the outside world through the veil of human perception and through the veil of our entire history of previous experiences, our entire life's worth of previous experiences. However, by the time the work of science is communicated to the public, that interpretation and uncertainty is often distilled down and is likely disregarded. But that doesn't mean that the interpretation and the uncertainty aren't there. Let's take an example, a hotly debated example. At least news media often portray it as hotly debated. Climate change. There is some uncertainty about climate change in the scientific community, but not as it's often portrayed in news media. There is consensus in the scientific community not only that the climate is going to change and that that change was caused by humans, but also that it has already changed in ways that will be and already is dangerous to human life. The uncertainty comes more in the form of what precisely those dangers will look like and when and where those dangers will or already are taking place. If you're interested in learning more about uncertainty and climate change, I have a really great reading for you, in all that spare time that I know you totally have. So anyway, climate change is a great example to give here because it highlights why Miller disagrees with the positivist view of science and why she disagrees with the windowpane theory of language. A positivist view of science doesn't allow for the nuances of the work of science and the nuances of the rest of the world around science. It would say that either climate change is real or it isn't, and the windowpane theory of language would say that, well, as long as your language is clear enough, anyone should be able to see the facts about climate change. But because the science is the work of a community, and that scientific community is just one community in, millions of communities across the world, each of which has its own goals and needs and desires and agendas, right? Part of the work of the scientific community is to communicate both among themselves and with all of those other communities about that science. But here's the thing. Part of scientists' communication involves communicating how they came to their conclusions and why their readers should trust their methods. And the specifics and nuances of those methods take literal years to learn. In the US, to get a doctorate degree, it takes about a decade, and even after they graduate, postdocs continue to learn in the field before they become professors. And scientists who are in the same field, who have studied the same methods, can communicate more easily to each other because they've spent about a decade entrenched in the same language and jargon and methods, and they likely have similar understandings of the ways that the field and that field's methods work. When scientists try to communicate those methods to people who haven't spent a literal decade entrenched in that same discourse community of other scientists, things can get much more complicated. And this is where it's easy to fall into the trap of believing the windowpane theory of language, because if you believe the windowpane theory of language, you can say, well, if scientists could just write more clearly, then general audiences would be able to understand the facts of science. But here's the thing. You can't just make a decade's worth of knowledge and experience in the scientific community clearer because language isn't a window to meaning. There are things and experiences and scientific methods in the world, and then there are words to describe those things. Words that each have their own shades of meaning, but words are not the same things as those meanings. Take this famous piece by Magritte as an example. The French text translates to, "This is not a pipe." But it is a pipe, isn't it? No, it's a picture of a pipe. A picture of a pipe is not the same thing as the actual pipe, and neither is the word pipe, or pipe in French. When we use language, we all carry around an entire life's worth of experiences with that language. We also carry around our own goals, desires, wants, and needs that may contradict the goals, desires, wants, and needs of the people that we're speaking with. So when a scientist makes a claim about a scientific method in a conference presentation to a room full of scientists, those other scientists filter the language presented to them through their entire life's worth of experiences with that science and their own goals, wants, needs, and desires. And from there, they make judgments about whether or not to trust the person speaking and the presentation they're making based on their own experiences and goals and wants and needs and desires. The same thing happens when that same scientist speaks to a more general audience, but that audience might have a massively different set of experiences, wants, goals, needs, desires than the room full of scientists. And this brings us back to our first question. Why does Miller argue that technical writing classes should count towards students' humanities course requirements? Because in both of those examples, a scientist speaking to a room full of other scientists and scientists speaking to a more general audience, in both of these examples, the scientist still has to persuade each group that they can trust the scientist's methods and conclusions. In any act of human communication, the speaker or writer has to persuade the reader or listener that they can be trusted, though sometimes those efforts at persuasion are more or less obvious. Regardless of the scenario, maybe you caught the key word in there, persuasion. Persuasion is the work of rhetoric. It involves, as Miller writes, an understanding of how to belong to a community, how to build trust with your audience within that community, and this ability to belong to a community and build trust within that community, Miller says, is more than just a set of skills. It's the work of a humanities classroom. Phew, so that was a lot to take in. If you need to, I recommend you watch that part of the video a few times to really understand it, because those are principles that our entire course will be based on. But for now, let's move on to the last question, which was a bit more personal. Which of the Gopin and Swan strategies do you think will most benefit your own writing? This, of course, depends on your own reading of the article and your own previous experiences with your own writing. It was also a separate article in the Miller article, so if you missed that, be sure to go back and read the Gopin and Swan piece in addition to the Miller piece. Actually, I recommend you revisit the Gopin and Swan piece frequently throughout the semester as we actually begin to do some writing. Several of their strategies will also be repeated in the Style book by Williams and Bizup, and you'll have the opportunity to practice the strategies in the editing exercises you'll start next week. All right, I've taken up enough of your time for today. The next two things on your plate are the case study and the editing exercise for next week, due at 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, September 4th. As always, email with any questions. Have a great weekend.